What kind of man would violate his enemy as wife upon the altar of a church, and then force her to serve him wine during the celebration banquet? Who would turn a noblewoman's wedding night into a public spectacle of humiliation, simply because her husband dared to defy him? What kind of warrior believes that possessing the women of his rivals is a divine right, more sacred than any code of honor? This man was the medieval knight, and everything you have been taught about them is a lie. Imagine you have just witnessed the fall of an enemy castle. Flames devour the towers. The cries of the defeated vanish into the wind, and you are one of the wives of the fallen defenders. Suddenly, a man in golden armor approaches. His helmet gleams under the firelight. His sword still drips with your husband's fresh blood. They told you knights protect ladies, but this one looks at you as if you are the prize of war. Sounds like a nightmare. It was the reality in the 11th century, and what I am about to tell you will forever change your perception of medieval chivalry. They sold you the image of the gallant knight, this noble warrior who rescues maidens and defends honor. They made you believe in courtly romance, in Christian devotion, in immaculate codes of honor. But the historical truth is that medieval knights had a systematic and documented practice that turned the wives of their enemies into literal spoils of war. It was called jus primae noctis in Latin, the right of the first night. But this was only the official name of something far more perverse, because it was not about a single knight. It was an entire system of domination that converted noble women into living trophies. Chroniclers of the time, the very same who glorified the Crusades, documented in detail how a victorious knight could claim not only the lands of his fallen enemy, but also his wife, his daughters, even his sisters. And he did this publicly, as a demonstration of his new authority over those territories. Do you think I am exaggerating? In the year 1099, during the siege of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon established what he called the rules of sacred spoil. These rules specifically detailed how to distribute among his men not only the captured gold and weapons, but also the widows and orphans of the defeated Muslims. But this was only the beginning, because what these supposed noble warriors did after the initial conquest, in the intimacy of their newly acquired domains, defies any notion of honor. They had specific rituals, planned ceremonies of humiliation designed to psychologically break the women of the defeated families. And this was not merely spontaneous sexual violence in the heat of battle. It was a calculated, cold system, planned to send a terrifying message to any feudal lord thinking of resisting. If you defied me, I will not only kill you, I will claim everything you love and make it mine. The Catholic Church not only knew about this but officially blessed these practices. The same popes who preached virtue and purity had secret documents legitimizing these actions as divine punishment upon infidels and heretics. But what they did during the nights of conquest, these private ceremonies, in the halls of newly taken castles, that is what will truly disturb you. Because discovering this specific method, they used to break the dignity of these women, will reveal a side of medieval chivalry that history books chose to hide forever. Godfrey of Bouillon was not born a monster. He was born the son of a respected count in Boulogne, educated in the finest monasteries of France, trained since childhood in the codes of Christian chivalry. At 20 years old, he was considered a model of virtue. By 30, he would become the architect of one of the most organized systems of terror in medieval history. What transformed this young nobleman into a machine of sexual domination was something that happened in the year 1096 during the First Crusade, something that chroniclers of the time recorded but modern historians chose to ignore. During the siege of Nicaea, Godfrey witnessed how the Byzantine commanders treated the captured Turkish women. They did not kill them. They did not release them. They systematically incorporated them into a hierarchy of servitude that included forced labor, arranged marriages, and something they called conjugal redistribution. The wives of defeated enemies became property to be distributed among the victorious soldiers, like horses or weapons. Not horrified, fascinated, he began to take detailed notes on these methods. He studied how to break the psychological resistance of captives, how to use public humiliation to establish domination, how to transform noble wives into living symbols of his victory. He was creating a manual of psychological warfare through the violation of conjugal rights. But this was only the beginning. When they finally reached Jerusalem in the year 1009, Godfrey had already developed what he secretly called total conquest protocols. It was not enough to defeat the enemy army. One had to annihilate their dignity, their lineage, their capacity for future resistance. And the most effective way to do this was through the systematic humiliation of the women of their families. The rules of sacred spoil that he established in Jerusalem were not merely military guidelines. They were a meticulously planned system of institutionalized sexual domination. Every captured woman was classified by age, beauty, and social position. The youngest and most beautiful were reserved for the commanders, the older ones for the common soldiers, those of high lineage for public humiliation ceremonies. Godfrey personally supervised these distributions. He did not delegate. He himself chose who would get whom, based on criteria that included not only the soldier's military value, but also his ability to properly break the resistance of the captives. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who accompanied Godfrey throughout the campaign, wrote in his private accounts about nightly ceremonies in the Crusader camps. Ceremonies where the wives of the slain Muslim defenders were forced to serve wine to the very men who had killed their husbands, where they were obliged to watch as their children were forcibly baptized into the Christian faith, where they had to publicly declare their gratitude for being saved from heresy. But Fulcher also recorded something even more disturbing. Godfrey was not merely copying Byzantine methods, he was perfecting them. He was creating new rituals, more sophisticated ways of breaking human dignity. He was transforming the violation of conjugal rights into an art of war. In the year 1209, during the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, a young squire named Bernard of Comminges wrote a letter to his mother that was never sent. This letter was found centuries later in the Vatican archives, and what it reveals about the conquest rituals goes far beyond what any historian dared to publish. Bernard describes in detail what happened after the capture of the city. When the Crusaders finally broke through the defenses, they did not merely sack the city. They organized what they called purification ceremonies. The wives and daughters of the heretic Cathars were gathered in the main square, not to be executed, but for something Bernard described as re-education through sacred humiliation. The women were forced to strip publicly while the knights recited biblical passages about female submission. Then they were made to kneel before each crusader and kiss their swords, symbolizing their renunciation of heresy and acceptance of Christian authority. But this was only the first act of a ceremony that lasted 3 consecutive days. On the second day, the captives were taken individually to the commanders' tents, where they were subjected to what the Crusaders called carnal baptism. It was not mere violation. It was an elaborate ritual where the woman had to declare, during the act, that she was being purified of her sins through the blessing of the Christian knight. Godfrey of Bouillon had created specific formulas they were forced to repeat, turning the assault into a perverse religious staging. But Bernard recorded something even more unsettling. The knights began to compete among themselves to see who could more completely break the resistance of their captives. They developed sophisticated psychological techniques. They forced the women to write letters to dead relatives, begging forgiveness for having followed the Cathar heresy. They made mothers watch as their daughters underwent the rituals. They created situations where the captives had to choose between suffering themselves or seeing their daughters suffer. And that was not the worst, because the Crusaders discovered that breaking a noble woman psychologically was more effective than killing her. A dead woman became a martyr. A broken woman became a living propaganda of Crusader power. So they developed methods to keep the captives functional, but completely submissive. They created what they called war marriages. The widows of defenders were forced to marry the Crusaders who had killed their husbands. But these were not normal marriages. They were public ceremonies where the woman had to declare her gratitude to the knight for having freed her from a heretical marriage. She had to publicly affirm that she preferred being the wife of her conqueror to being the widow of her original husband. The chronicler Peter of Vaux de Cernay, who initially glorified these practices, years later wrote in his private diaries about what he had truly witnessed. He described knights who kept collections of conquered wives, each marked with specific symbols indicating from which battle they had been captured. Women who were displayed at banquets as living trophies, forced to tell guests how their new husbands were superior to their previous ones. But Godfrey's system was evolving. It was no longer limited to the Crusades. It had returned to Europe and spread among the feudal nobility like an epidemic of institutionalized brutality. French, German, and English knights began applying the total conquest protocols in their own local wars. The most disturbing truth is not what medieval knights did to the wives of their enemies. It is what they did to their own wives. In the year 1223, a secret document was discovered in the personal archives of King John Lackland of England. It was a detailed manual titled Domestic Domination Protocols, directly based on Godfrey of Bouillon's methods. But this manual was not for wartime use. It was for use at home, with the nobility's own wives. The document revealed that knights saw no distinction between conquering enemy territories and controlling their own families. They applied the same rituals of humiliation, the same methods of psychological breaking, the same domination techniques they had perfected in the Crusades. Their legitimate wives were treated as permanent spoils of war. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, wrote in her secret memoirs about what she called the golden hell of nobility. She described private ceremonies where knights' wives were forced to participate in submission renewal rituals. They had to kneel publicly before other nobles and declare their gratitude for being their husband's property. But Eleanor recorded something even more shocking. She discovered there was a secret network of knights who exchanged wives among themselves, not for pleasure, but as a demonstration of absolute power. They called this conjugal diplomacy. A knight could lend his wife to another as a way of sealing political alliances, and the woman had no right even to know when she would be transferred. The Catholic Church not only permitted these practices, it officially codified them. Pope Innocent III created in the year 1215 a document called Regulamentum Coniugale, which established that a wife who refused to participate in her knight husband's submission duties could legally be punished with imprisonment in monasteries specialized in female These monasteries were in reality centers of psychological torture. Trained nuns applied the same dignity-breaking methods that crusaders used on captured women. Rebellious wives were kept in total isolation, forced to copy thousands of times texts about female obedience, subjected to extreme fasting until they agreed to return to their husbands adequately humble. The system had become so institutionalized that knights' daughters were trained from childhood to accept these protocols as normal. They learned that their worth as women depended solely on their ability to fulfill the domination rituals of their future husbands. They were educated in submission schools run by the same nuns, who re-educated rebellious wives. But in the year 1247, something broke the system. A plague epidemic struck Europe and killed half of the male population. Suddenly, the surviving women found themselves free from the domination protocols, simply because there were not enough men to enforce them. And when the knights tried to re-establish the system after the epidemic, they discovered something terrifying. The women had tasted their own strength. They had managed properties, commanded armies, governed entire territories. They would not accept returning to the previous system. The truth is that what we know as courtly love and romantic chivalry was nothing more than a propaganda campaign created by the knights themselves to disguise centuries of systematic brutality. They invented poems about rescued maidens and gallant knights to hide a reality where they were the true monsters of medieval history. And if you want to know more about how these practices influence the formation of modern societies, leave a comment below, because this story has consequences that reach to this very day.